Village of Tinley Park Plan Commission to order, beginning with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Can we get a roll call, please?
Stanton.
Here.
Engel.
Here.
Manning.
Here.
Gatto. Gray.
Here.
Aitchison. Here. Augustiniak.
Present.
Vic.
Here.
Chairman Shaw.
Present. Okay. Everybody is here. And on the agenda is communications. Do we have anything from staff?
No.
Okay. Well, with that, I thought about bringing this up at the end of the meeting, but I see that Paula is here, and she did say that she wanted to say a couple of words. So with that, I'd like to announce to the commission that tonight will be my last Plan Commission meeting. I have tendered my resignation for the Plan Commission, and tonight will be my last meeting. I'm going to tell all of you that I have really enjoyed serving on the Plan Commission for just about 3 years, and I've enjoyed working with all of you guys, and definitely with staff, Paula, Kimberly, Dan. Can't forget Barrow over here. So, thank you. And Paula did say that she wanted to say a few words.
You know, actually, when you say those dates, I looked them up as well, and I couldn't believe it's only been 3 years. Because, well, first of all, on behalf of staff, we want to thank you very much for your service. And I think all of you know that this is public service, and this epitomizes what we are all about. We're here for the Village of Tinley Park, and we care about it. And I know personally, having so many off-the-record conversations with Ken, he cares deeply about Tinley Park. He's passionate about Tinley Park, and that's what I respected most about him. Sometimes it's made it difficult in our conversations, because if my passion is going in a different direction than Ken's, but you have to respect someone that feels so strongly about this village that he is willing to put himself out there and do it every time there's a meeting and every time outside of these meetings where he's out there learning and talking and trying to make sure he's doing the best job possible. And that's why I'm so surprised it's 3 years. And I mean that very positive, because I've had so many conversations with Ken, and I know staff has as well. And those conversations are not 5-minute conversations. Those are in-depth conversations, and I'm not trying to be facetious or disrespectful. I'm in awe, because I know when I'm going to talk to Ken, I have to be on my toes. I have to know what I'm talking about. It's, and no disrespect to anybody else, but this is a layperson job. You guys don't come here as planners. You all have your unique disciplines, and they collectively help us make the best decisions. But you hired us to provide the professional expertise. But in Ken's case, he's sort of like a quasi-planner. I mean, he loves this stuff. So, you know, when he would come to me with a question about the code, or a question about the comprehensive plan, or a question on something like that, he came to me already having done hours of research, so I couldn't just sort of flip the plane, pass him off and say, well, this is what urban planners do. This is not what urban planners do, because he understands it. So I tell you from personally, from the bottom of my heart, I respect you greatly, and I really respect the work that you have done, and I am really sorry you're doing this. I think it's going to be a loss for the village. I think it's going to be a loss for the commission. I'm sure you will all rise to the occasion, and we will expect it of you, but you have big shoes to follow with Ken leaving. So thank you.
Thank you. Now you see what. Thank you, Paula. I appreciate that.
Unscripted.
Yeah,
on my heart.
it's been a great pleasure. I'm reading from my script right now, so it's been a great pleasure working with all of you guys, as I said. And now you see why I wanted to do that at the end of the meeting. But unless somebody has other communications and want to top that, we'll move on with approval of the minutes of the March 21st, 2019 regular meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes? So moved. Commissioner Stanton. Second? Second, Commissioner Aitchison. I looked over there because I knew that she would want it. So, any corrections, comments, edits on the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor of approving the minutes from the March 21st, 2019 regular meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved. This evening, we have a single item on the agenda. It is a workshop for the telecommunication service and small cell wireless facilities text amendment, something that we had discussed a while back, and then I think there was, I'm sure you guys will fill us in, there was some additional legislation and they took it back, and I will not even attempt to steal your thunder here. So let's proceed
Yeah,
with the
so this
staff.
is just a workshop here. This goes back to 2017, and it includes kind of an overhaul of our wireless communications code, so cell phone antennas. The term kind of telecommunication service facilities is kind of the catch-all for anything cell phone related, anything wireless related, any data transferring. So kind of that catch-all. This includes kind of the regulations with co-locations, new freestanding towers, small cell antennas. Freestanding towers kind of becoming less common and less typical, and small cell antennas kind of ramping up in terms of what the cell phone companies are looking to do. And then distributed antenna systems, which is DAS for short, which are like building communication towers. So this kind of is all encompassing for those. As Ken said, this kind of goes back to 2017. It was a comprehensive kind of overhaul. I believe it even had its first reading at the village board. It was waiting for its second reading, and the village attorney kind of put a pause on it because the state was working on or had introduced some bills that would kind of preempt a lot of what we had known anyway. So just to avoid some situation like that, we kind of held off because these regulations are changing pretty quick in terms of the technology as well as kind of how the state regulates them as well as how the FCC regulates them. I'll say the cell phone companies have a very, very deep pockets and a lot of pull in, not just Illinois, but all across the board. So even the regulations, the preemptions that the village, the municipalities have to deal with changes pretty regularly. So that kind of to kick this off, the kind of one of the biggest acts that controls kind of the telecommunication industry and what we do was in 1996, and that pretty much prohibits us from having any effect of prohibiting wireless facilities, so it allows you to kind of regulate where they can go a little bit, but you can't anytime flat out prohibit them. It also basically takes away that any decision for any wireless facility can't be based on environmental or health effects. So this will come up anytime, or most of the times you guys probably have a variation where someone wants to talk about the health effects of cell phone towers. So nothing in our regulations, and then if someone's doing a variation, nothing you guys base your decision on can be based on that. So that's supposed to be left up to the FCC, and I guess the point of that being that we can't really be health experts here as a local municipality. That's kind of the way they deemed it, is that we don't have enough information to make the correct decision based on those. And FCC apparently does. So after in 2017 was when we kind of had drafted some initial changes. I'll do a shout out to Stephanie, who did a lot of the legwork on this, and you guys have heard from her. So she had pretty much everything ready, along with our attorneys that looked at everything. And then when it was put on hold, so April 2018 is when Illinois Senate Bill 1451, it's the Small Cell Wireless Facilities Deployment Act, that was signed into law by the governor. So that basically established some statewide regulations for small cell antennas when they're co-located in the public rights of way, an existing utility pole. So basically said, we can't prohibit them, you have to allow them to go in, and that it preempted us in terms of building permit fees, review time, some level of aesthetics and location and everything, and basically saying that you can't, not only can you not prohibit them, but you can't make them a special use. So, and that only occurred in the public rights of way though, so that didn't regulate all small cell antennas across the village, but at least within co-location in the public right of way. So soon after that, it gave us kind of 2 months to get some stuff in order to regulate it at all. So if you didn't pass an ordinance, basically they were allowed everywhere without any cost. So we did pull together the requirements. It didn't really go through you guys, not only at the time, but because we were basically being as restrictive as we could, and most municipalities have done that. It was based off a model code done by the Illinois Municipal League. So most municipalities adopted that. It's actually in our municipal code because it deals with our public rights of way. So the village's community development committee and then the village board adopted that fairly quickly to make sure that if someone came in with an application, you didn't have to just blatantly approve it. No regulations. So following that, there was, I guess the point of the code is kind of geared towards the new 5G, or the point of that ordinance was part of the 5G networks that they're rolling out. And these typically require kind of a greater coverage in urban areas, and it was kind of a way to promote that technology across the state that wherever the cell phone companies wanted to put them, they kind of had a known set of regulations that they didn't have to go through each municipality and learn what their codes and their boards were. Good. So it's kind of meant to help expedite that rollout within Illinois and have us be kind of on pace with everyone else. And I believe now it's up to 22 states that have more or less kind of that same ordinance. And some other ones that are on the way as well. So following that, the FCC put in, they don't really pass as much laws, but they kind of have rules that it really typically municipalities and other entities you want to follow because there can be some legal ramifications, but they're not really laws per se, more rules. So they, similar to kind of other antennas, there's a thing called a shot clock that basically when someone, when a carrier, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, bring in a permit to do an antenna, you basically have a certain amount of time where you either have to respond to them, that it's approved, deny it based on a certain set of things, as well as steps that they can take to get approval, or steps they have to take to get approval, and that you basically can't just drag out that review process. So that shot clock was pushed onto small cell antennas as well. It also kind of, a lot of the requirements for cell phones were, it basically calls it, I believe, the fifth utility or whatever, and basically any requirements that you have for other utilities and your rights of way basically need to be carried over to cell phone technology as well, and wireless technology. So, walk through the code a little bit, but just since some of you were here, some of you weren't, I'll kind of walk through some of the major changes from our current code. Sorry, moving too quick, skipping the slide. So there's some, just some general I'll kind of go through the biggest updates from the last set of plans that are basically ready to go, and some of the changes we made there, and then I can maybe kind of walk back through the code in its whole and kind of tell you the different types of technology that we're regulating and how we're regulating them. So the biggest things are exempting anything that follows that state small cell Act are basically exempted from this code, with the exception of some kind of additional design standards that we added for small cell wireless facilities. So that was kind of our biggest addition to what Stephanie had done and to what was about to be adopted. Was exempting anything that falls under the Act and then implementing some design standards. Those design standards are kind of the one thing that's still, anything that falls under the code still has to follow those design standards. So we can't regulate how they're approved or timing or location. That's all covered under that separate ordinance. But these design standard sections will still apply to them. So we also changed a few other things, just kind of looking through the code. We wanted to make sure that we basically required the disguising of cell phone towers when they were either within a residential district or within 1,000 feet of a residential district. That there would still always be an option if someone could ask for a variation from that, but we would, I can kind of get into the points of it and how they look later, but whether it's designed to be a tree or a flagpole or something else, then it wouldn't just look like a big monopole. So we added that kind of increased regulation in there. The previous one just kind of said they preferred people to use them, but didn't really have any teeth in it. It wasn't really set as a requirement. We included just some consistency in the wording throughout it. And then kind of the other big thing we did was kind of just reorganize it, make a more clear hierarchy of how someone should kind of walk through this code. That basically, kind of step one is that co-locations on existing towers, existing buildings, they're already there, they're probably pretty ugly, but they're there, they're gonna stay there. We might as well use that kind of existing infrastructure, the existing sites, to the greatest extent possible. So those you can do that. Step two on the hierarchy is new cellular facilities that would be on village-owned property. We kind of have the regulation as well as the land typically to make that work, as well as if it would go through some sort of a public process in terms of the leasing agreements, as well as basically any of these new towers I'm about to list where they go would still require site plan approval. So if it doesn't exist now, it would still come before you guys for review, just from a site plan level, as well as a special use. So any new facility, as we propose these, would be a special use. So that's a discussion point we can get into maybe a little bit later if you guys have any views on that. After the village, though, so after co-location, village property, after that is kind of other public and taxing body properties. Kind of the same, similar situation, like I said, the village property. Then the M1 zoning district, but excluding anything that's close within 1,000 feet of residential property. Then after that is the ORI district, which also same exception, anything within 1,000 feet of residential property. Then the following that is any facility within our business districts, as well as our R1 districts, not preferred, but kind of in the hierarchy of where we want to go. That would be next. And then the absolute last one is anything within our legacy district, which is our primary downtown and anything along Oak Park Avenue, which has a pretty historic feel that we're going for. There's some historic buildings in there. We've got a lot of money kind of put into the aesthetics of how it looks and where it's going to go. Hopefully even get better. So that kind of being the absolute last zoning districts that we kind of want, or locations we want to see them in. And again, any of these, at any site that would have new ground equipment or a new location would be site plan, including co-location. So if someone's going on an existing tower and they have to do a new structure on the bottom to screen their equipment, they would have to come before you. If there's enough space and they can go in an existing one, though, that would be the only time where even site plan approval wouldn't be required. So. Just a quick walkthrough. So this is kind of example of some freestanding towers. On the left is what you kind of think of your typical monopole. Sometimes you'll get 3 or 4 sets of antennas on one pole like that. That we allow them up to 100 feet, I believe. The middle one's just kind of a disguised antenna with a flagpole. Those obviously blend in a little better, a little patriotic, but you can usually only fit 1 set of antennas kind of within there. Once it's designed and put up, there's usually not a ton of room to kind of co-locate within them. So kind of one downside of those. And then the one on the right's our monopine, I believe is the term for them. So you can usually fit multiple sets within there, but obviously those will only blend in some situations. If it's around a forest or something like that, they work pretty well. Or mixed in with other pines, but otherwise sometimes those could stick out just as much as monopole if you put it in a place with no trees. So this is some kind of examples of co-location. So the monopole with co-location on it, village water tower that's got antennas located within it, and then an existing building. Not necessarily what we want to see, but from an aesthetic wise, because I think most people have seen that building in town, and that we've changed some of our code to not allow them to kind of go above the roof like that as we proposed it. But just an example of a co-location on an existing tall building that could be done better, but still on an existing structure at least. These are some examples of our small cell antennas, and I can get into those design standards a little bit more, but these just kind of show kind of your typical setup on light poles as well as a utility pole. Most of the small cells we've seen come in so far have been on ComEd utility poles, so I think we have 4 or 5 of those have already actually come through our department. We do review them, but again, permitted use when they're in the right of way and following our regulations. There's a couple other images that were also placed in your staff report, just kind of showing what they look like, how they kind of operate, the different setups within, how they're placed on towers and kind of how they're connected and work. And then here's one that I don't believe was in your staff report, but just kind of shows you there's a couple different ways, whether it's a utility pole or a light pole, how they can kind of be, how the equipment can be arranged on the pole. And these are pretty typical for what we've seen installed here as well as in the surrounding towns. And then this is a brief example, a simple example of what a DAS system is, or distributed antenna system. Kind of usually an outside anchor point of where the wireless signals come from, and that kind of feeds through a building. Is pretty typical of arenas. I believe the amphitheater might have one now already installed in it. So if you were wondering why 2 years ago you started being able to get an actual signal in the amphitheater during a concert, that's one of the reasons why. It's always kind of up to the person that installs it too, as to what networks get into it and what kind of signals they send out. But this is just kind of a brief example of how what they kind of look like in a simplified form. I can just, I guess, focusing a little bit more on the small cell design standards. I can kind of walk through those and just kind of let you know some of what we've proposed here. I believe it's page 8 in the code you got, so if you have it as part of the packet, you can follow along. So And again, these are just design standards for small cell antennas, and those are on private property or if they are on, in the public rights of way. So it kind of limits the overall size. It pushes them to be stealth. Stealth has a lot of different meanings, but this has basically said that, you know, that to the greatest extent possible, you have to make it blend in with that existing pole. So I think they've got a pretty standardized equipment, but as that changes, we've kind of left this language, try to make it loose enough that, you know, if something better comes along, we can push for that in here. We have some height requirements for them, so they can basically only go 10 feet, 10 feet above the pole with their antenna and their equipment that they attach, and that's a pretty standard requirement across the board for these. And then we have a minimum height for the equipment attached to the pole. So we want the equipment attached to the pole and not really accessible on the base. We don't want to be able to have cars hit it or kids play with it or be able to get into it at all. And kind of raise it up high where it kind of blends in with the rest of the light pole up there. So that has a minimum height of 12 feet above grade. So it would be on the pole, but not accessible to any normal person without a ladder of some sort. There's requirements for basically pole visual interference. So if we have signage, we have banners, we have flowers on our poles throughout the village, basically it can't interfere with those things that we have on our pole, including, you know, our holiday banners, and I think the flowers are the most typical. So they'd still be allowed on those poles, but basically their equipment can't block them, can't cover it up. There are some extensions that are placed on these, and we also regulate that those extensions kind of blend into the pole, that there's height required. They still have to meet that 10-foot height requirement, but saying anything kind of coming off the pole has to blend in with the rest of the pole. Any wires and cables on these poles have to be hidden, so I believe even one of these examples, you can kind of see some wiring coming out of it. We basically said you either have to run it with inside the pole. Sometimes those poles have so much cabling through them, if for some reason they're smart lights or something like that. Sometimes they can't fit them in the pole or it's not practical. Then they would have to do some kind of cable shield around the entirety of the wiring. So none of these you should be able to see wiring from here on out. Color we're regulating, so basically it has to blend in to the existing pole or equipment or location that it's at, some kind of neutral color. These could be mounted on buildings as well, so they would have to blend into the existing building, and then no reflective materials, so as you're driving, you're not going to get blinded if the sun's hitting it in the right direction. We have covering requirements for antenna panels, guy wires. Basically, if someone's going on an existing pole, it has to be structurally sound, and we do have a requirement in that kind of overarches everything here, as well as in the small cell section for a right-of-way that basically has requirements for these to be structurally sound. They have to submit as built drawings, engineering that proves these are safe. But this basically, we have a limit in there that you can't add guy wires to an existing pole to make it structurally sound. So if they wanted to do that, they could potentially replace the whole pole as it stands and still go on that pole, but they can't just add anchors to it in terms of guy wires. If they're there existing on the pole holding it up, we don't really have a method to be able to make the utility company remove them, and we can't really make the carriers kind of pay for that upgrade either. So the next one we have is kind of the one that's up for debate right now and may change before the public hearing, and that is our original intent was to keep these off of kind of our decorative lantern light poles that we have in the downtown and down Oak Park Avenue, as well as some decorative poles, I believe, on like 80th Avenue that we have. So we really want to keep them off of those. Most of them probably couldn't handle an antenna in the structural side of it anyways. But if someone could make that work, we still really don't want it because it's just the aesthetics of them. With that being said, we have our attorneys looking at this section. Is it legal? What's the strongest language we can have in there in terms of prohibiting them? That's really kind of the last case. And we have a little, in our discussion points, we kind of have that as maybe a discussion item for you guys too, is would you rather see these on private property or on a gas station canopy or something like that before you saw them on our decorative light poles? We proposed it as, yes, that's kind of the last situation, but we have that as kind of a discussion point for you guys. Undergrounding is kind of a long section, so if there is any equipment that someone couldn't attach to the pole, there are situations where you'd have equipment. We basically require it to be undergrounded with all their equipment unless it's determined that it can't happen. Whether there's something underground right there, there's not enough room, as well as the state law kind of says that we can't require some of this equipment to be undergrounded if we don't require other utilities to do it as well. So this is basically saying at all means you got to try and underground it, but if you can't, basically they'd have to go through and make sure it's basically not obtrusive, it's not blocking a required sidewalk, it's not blocking ADA sidewalk requirements that we as a village or IDOT have to follow, and then it's basically screened to the greatest extent possible to blend in with the surroundings. So there is a chance that there would be equipment on the ground, but in this case, we'd push for either it to be buried, and then if they can't, follow those requirements. And then we have specific screening requirements as well. So basically that in the case that we might have something on the ground, that there would be landscaping, fencing, painting of the cabinet for the box that basically they could follow. That this would be required kind of for as to the greatest extent possible we can push on ones within our right-of-way, and then as a requirement also for anything that would have a site plan approval, special use approval, or variation request that came before you guys. So if someone does a small cell on private property, it would be a special use, it would have site plan approval, and it would come before you. Unfortunately, we can't do that with ones in our right-of-way because of the state law. But this at least sets some of those screening requirements up ahead of time. So you guys wouldn't be able to review them, but for any other ones not in our right of way, you guys would have that chance to review them. We're going to be making sure they look as good as possible and kind of fit our mold. So then we have burial or removal of utility poles. So basically saying if we're burying poles that they have an antenna on, that we can give them 90 days notice. The pole gets removed. 90 days notice to kind of remove their equipment off a utility pole. And this kind of mirrors what's been allowed by the state law. And this would basically, they have to remove them, otherwise it gets removed. This kind of, especially within our downtown, kind of matters as we're burying poles now. It also prevents someone from going on a pole that has a plan or has a current plan in place or is being studied to be buried. So basically not letting someone go on a pole that 3 months later we're going to tell them to take it off. The facilities, small cell facilities can't be illuminated, can't have signage. kind of the basic things that we require of any poles as well, or any cell phone towers. Can't be illuminated, can't have signage. Besides that, I don't know, is there anything else I can think of that stuck out? We did add a number of definitions as well that happened in 2017. Most of those have stayed the same. The main one that changed was the definition of utility pole, which mirrors the state law definition as well as the one that's in our village code. So just keeping that consistent. The previous utility pole didn't really include light poles, but now that is part of the definition. It's a light pole or even a stoplight pole can be a utility pole. So that's kind of included in there. And now we just kind of have one consistent definition of that. So. I think that's it for our staff report for now. I'm sure you guys have some questions, and then we kind of have some considerations for you guys. One of those, I guess I can go over kind of the questions we thought you guys may want to discuss, and that we're maybe looking for a little bit of feedback on. The main one being that kind of historically our code now, as well as in the past, has required that any new tower is a special use. So any new cell phone tower has to go through a special use process. It goes before you guys, opens up debate to the public. So, and it's kind of allowed their input on it. Kind of understanding that Telecommunications Act, that we can't regulate environmental health effects. Basically, our only goal here would be aesthetics. To one, prove that they've tried, they found that, yes, we're doing the least kind of obtrusive cell phone tower that we were doing, and that also anything aesthetically that they're doing that to the greatest extent possible. So our kind of question to you guys was, is there some situations where you'd be comfortable that this really shouldn't go through a special use process, and they would still be required to do due diligence to prove they can't co-locate somewhere, but let's say someone has done that, and you know, we have a consultant as well that could review that data.
So Dan,
Sure.
how about we do this? Because I know for me anyway, by the time you get to the last one, I'll forget the first one.
Sure.
So
I'll kind of, as I go, stop, and we can.
yeah. So here's my thought, and I'll leave it to you because these are probably the ones that you had questions about. This is what you need answers to. If we also have questions, we'll deal with those, right?
Yep.
All right. So I think we're on the same page then. So on this first one about special use, you want the discussion now, the thoughts for it, or you have?
Yeah, if you guys have
Okay.
any thoughts on that, like I said, it's just that kind of, we know how it's historically been, but is there any situations where you guys would, on that hierarchy, which I can go back to, that you'd be okay with?
Well, so,
And there would still be site plan approval for it, so it could, but.
Right.
The biggie is that the public is not going to be as aware from the public.
because it doesn't require a public hearing.
And it expedites the approval process of
Yep.
it by not going to the board, so.
So I'm just going to run through the commission real quick, see if anyone has a comment on that. I will just say, and I think Commissioner Stanton's probably the only other one that's been here that long. I honestly only remember in the past couple of years, two coming before us. There's only two that stand out in my mind. Is the frequency, I mean, is, from what you can see historically, is that kind of a common frequency? Is the industry, are you getting a sense that because of the new act and the technology that we're anticipating a lot more in the future?
For new antennas, we're not. But for the most part, the full antenna, new kind of towers that we're talking about have more or less been built out. It's probably unlikely we'll see many new ones. There still may be a few, but the majority of it's going towards small cell. So
Yeah, having worked in that industry, I know the.
As well as
the-
satellite phones are gonna be kind of the
Yeah.
6G step.
The
so.
technology is actually going in the other direction now, where they're getting far greater coverage and efficiency out of the existing network, you know, and they've, especially in our area, they've kind of built out, you know, they've got the coverage, and now they just are expanding the technology to strengthen the coverage and all that, but, so that's good. That's actually where I was thinking, so, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen, so you're right, we need to give it some thought. So, I think we'll just run down this end here. The question that you have for us is, number one, do we agree with this hierarchy, which is, it's very similar to what we had, right? And then the second question is, and logically, it would have to be from the top down, right?
Correct.
So, starting with the first one, would the commission be comfortable saying that, for instance, that's just a location that is allowed by right, period?
Yeah, and co-locations happen historically, but then, yeah, kind of following that one. Where, are you okay with, where are you kind of?
Where do we
okay
draw the
with
line,
that? Yeah.
right, as we go?
Or not at all, and you want,
Okay.
it stays there between co-location and new tenant.
You want to start at that end down there?
I'm good with everything that's been presented. I guess the question I have, though, is that existing locations right now, and for one example that you had to show the building with the 4 on each corner, how long are those for? The permit, is it like a number of years? Do they have to renegotiate? Do they, nothing?
They have to renegotiate on private property. In terms of our approvals, I believe that one even has a variation attached to it. So it basically runs with the land. It's approved. So we really can't require them to take those down after they're kind of up.
Or not
It's
even
kind of
take
how
them down,
we-
but maybe somehow kind of disguise them a little bit, or put a fence around, or do something that could,
I think it's relatively limited
Okay.
unless they,
replaced it?
unless they remove them at some
Okay.
point.
It's like a
And I believe-
fence.
or if they
Right.
got damaged and they had to replace them, then they'd have to go and
Yeah, the damage over 50%, I'm not even sure if that would do
Right.
it. It'd be a good legal question that we can
Right.
ask about, but I believe they basically have to be removed and not active for a certain amount of time before we could kind of place any additional
Right.
requirements on it. So,
Okay, all right. Other than that, I'm fine with, I think you did a good job in it.
As part of this, you had a separate question about the decorative light poles. Do you want to address that as a separate question?
that's up to you guys.
Well, I mean, that's.
I have it on.
It's not
here,
really
it wasn't in here.
covered explicitly in this list of locations, right?
Yeah, I think I might have added it to the PowerPoint, but I believe, yes, it's not in the one that you guys have in here.
Yeah, so the first bullet point under considerations that we're going through right now is really just that hierarchy, right?
Correct,
So
yeah.
let's answer that question for you guys.
Hierarchy and then, hierarchy being okay, and then maybe kind of just where do you draw that line?
Okay, sure. Commissioner Augustinian?
I'm good with the hierarchy. The only question I have is, so the lowest priority or in the hierarchy is something in the legacy district, but what about village-owned property within the legacy district? How does that change where something would go on the hierarchy? So it could go in the legacy district, higher priority as long as it was on a village building. Am I reading that correctly?
Now that you bring it up, that's how it reads to me.
Yeah, that's a good point,
So we have a nice new
Question.
plaza coming up there, and you can stick a pole right in the middle of it.
Well, yeah, and again, the village as property owners could always, we actually as property owners, it's not right of way.
Right.
Could always say no. So in a situation where that comes up where.
Because I'm envisioning the people in the building where like Primal Cut and Holstein's are couldn't put it, but they could put it on the firehouse, which is right behind it.
But that would get, yeah, and I guess the way it's laid out now, and it's up to you guys to kind of decide it, would be all village-owned property kind of first, allow it there, and just kind of,
Whether it's
you
in
know,
the legacy
the
district
village
or
then
not.
has control to say no, and then they get moved down the list. If the village says, no, we're not gonna let you on the firehouse,
Yeah.
then they move to the next step in this list, and that's
Yeah,
kind of.
and I'm just trying to avoid somebody going, well, how come they can
But
put it
that's a
over
good
there,
cl-
but you can't put it over here?
Yeah, that's a good clarification point. I definitely think in the text that we could add, so.
Okay.
So, well, to that end then, given that, I think, A, B, and C are all covering public property, right?
Correct. Or B and C, yeah, kind of after the co-location.
Oh, yes, you're right. So, I guess, from that perspective, we wouldn't necessarily, I don't think would want to have B and C on there by right, right? Or maybe you can clarify me, even if you said it's by right, the owner of the property still can say no, but that you get into a tricky thing where, you know, they have a right, but the village is still saying no.
Yeah, I mean,
But
they don't.
as long as the attorneys think that's okay, then.
Yeah, I would think so. As property owners, we can always say no, except for in the right of way. We can clarify that with our attorneys though, but in terms of other taxing bodies though, then the village wouldn't have control of saying no in that case.
Fair point.
So if there's a park in the legacy code or the central middle school or one of those, then, yeah, that would then leave it out of the village's hands, in that case. But I believe we can say no, where there's a zoning right to go there, but we have some reason aesthetically, communication-wise, we don't want it on top of our firehouse, just because it blocks, it makes things harder, it blocks signals or something like that. We always have that ability to say no.
Is the thought that special use is, from the attorneys, is, I mean, that's not considered burdensome to do that?
For cell phone towers, I mean, to some degree it is, but we just can't prohibit them. So
Right.
you can allow the special use everywhere, but you can't prohibit them. So
Okay.
the burdensome part is kind of the question of where does the village want that to be for cell phone towers? It is an extra step in it. They always have to do their due diligence, and they do their kind of coverage maps and everything that they present anyways, so.
I think the special use is a full ability that you can place conditions that are
Mhm.
reasonable, that, you know, you never know, a site can be unique and just
Right.
warrant something that it gives you guys that extra ability to say, hey, we want this. So there's always that nice component of special.
Yep. Down here, any, Commissioner H, anything?
I'm in agreement with the hierarchy, and I would rather see them on private property before the decorative poles.
For the small zone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hierarchy doesn't look too bad. I know residential is in F, it's absorbed in F over the legacy district, which I can see if you gotta quantify it, it's in there. I guess we'll probably talk about this later with the concern with the decorations. I think that's, we have a lot of temporary holiday decorations, so if you have something permanent on a light pole, for example, you have to really coordinate it with the decorations the village already has. And they're very ornate, and they change, so, but I guess we'll get to that more in depth later on. So for now, just the hierarchy, that looks reasonable.
Actually, just hearing from this side, I think we could probably dispense with that question about the legacy decorative light poles. I'm against that myself. Anybody, it sounded like you guys said no, for exactly all the reasons that you just said, plus more. Is there,
I agree, but the problem is if it's in the right of way, right, how can we?
Yeah, so
we
we're gonna
can't
change
deny
the
it.
language, because I don't think, it's a question I posed to our attorney today, so we don't.
Well, so here's what I
But
would say, and I
we
guess
can't
this-
prohibit it, but we want it to be clear that that is the absolute, they have to prove that they've tried everything else,
Yeah,
and that's
so-
where they have to go.
Right. So we'll put that caveat in there, assuming there's a legal way to do it without, violating somebody's rights there, I agree. Last resort, absolute, and the burden should be high that they haven't just said, we thought about it and we'd rather do it there. I mean,
Because, and most commercial, there's a lot of commercial properties around those decorative poles. There's a lot of other private parking lot light poles and things like that that they could tie into and beyond, where I think those are better than our decorative ones on the right-of-way. So,
Okay.
that would require them to prove there's none of those options exist.
So continuing down here, Commissioner Vick, on the
No,
question of the
hierarchy looks good to me, yeah, and in concerns with the legacy district stuff, we do, I think, have to look at that because we are building that up to have more people there, which means it's gonna be more of a draw. And with some of these new developments, such as the boulevard and anything else that's gonna come along, most likely they might look into getting into that, getting into that kind of stuff. So we definitely need to have good rules on how that stuff looks when they have it on top of those buildings. But it is something that we do need to, just can't say, oh, we don't want it in the legacy district. We just have to be pretty strong on how it looks, I think, because it is about aesthetics down there.
And that's a good, to kind of bring up the sentence in your staff report that stops under that considerations, I think was supposed to talk about being on existing buildings. And the way our code is written, basically, it allows them by right on any typical cell phone or antenna to be on the back and the sides of buildings, but they can't be on the front facade of a building. So that was kind of that question of, do you agree with that?
Well, one problem with that it says in here, unless I misread it, it says opposite the main, does it say opposite the main entrance? Because you look at, what's the steak place there? In Oak Park?
Primal Cut?
Primal Cut. The entrance is on the back side, so the front side is Oak Park Avenue.
Yeah, so I think the way the
code.
maybe
and
that's
that's where
on
they
there.
would end
Yeah,
up.
so the way the code is, because we kind of had this debate, was it says front of the building.
Okay.
It's kind of open to interpretation, but it's hard to figure out what the front is in a lot of situations.
yeah.
Well, that's a particular unique location that,
Yeah.
And Joe's.
every,
It's on the side.
every
yeah.
side is an entrance for Primal Cut, really.
Yeah.
And then the fourth side is under their building, so,
Yeah,
I mean,
So, but the goal being the front facade of the building, whatever
Yeah.
but even if you call out right away, that doesn't always work, like in, that building I had a picture of here, I mean, if you do it towards the main right of way, that it's addressed off of or something, that's Harlem, well, Harlem's the side of the building again.
Yeah.
But those requirements, so the requirements we have in here would require those to be brought down to the so we are stopping them at the parapet height now. So you can't go above the parapet height. And then they have to be painted to match the building. So this is similar to what we had in Hoffman Estates when I worked there, and they were on a lot of kind of taller buildings. We had a hospital and some tall buildings there where, honestly, these stick out like a sore thumb when you're driving down the street, but once you paint them and you drop them below the building and you paint them the same color as the building, you guys are gonna be the only ones that know they're there, or we might.
when you've
because
seen
we
those
issue
enough
different-
years, they
Yeah.
kind of, you forget seeing them.
Yeah.
First time you see them, they are kind of stark.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we, want to finish up this bullet? Any comments there?
No comments. I just want, I just echo my fellow commissioners, comments and concerns.
So on the hierarchy,
We changed it.
bullet point F,
I remember, so-
how it has, it
Can you-
combines.
Dan, can you switch to the hierarchy again? F?
Yeah, it combines the business and residential. Is there any way you can make that a different? Like if business higher, residential lower?
Yeah, we could add one more in there that says all business districts and then all residential, so we
That's,
could.
that's good to split them out. And are you proposing that business above residential?
Right.
Seems fair. Any
I concur with Commissioner.
thoughts against that, or?
Engel.
Yes,
All right.
yeah, I would agree with that.
It's good, Ed.
And those were, we typically didn't even have that in the hierarchy. The hierarchy just kind of stopped previous, in our current code now. So it got to the M1 and then just had nothing. But we couldn't prohibit them, so it was just kind of this, well, I guess they can go get a special use, but we wanted to just kind of break it down, make sure it's kind of all-inclusive of with the
No,
steps you need to take.
I think it's a
so.
good approach.
But that's like one more kind of step we can break it down into.
All right, so do you get enough feedback on that one?
Yep.
Move on to the next consideration that you had there?
Yeah, so the next one I believe is masonry enclosures that we had. Do you want, are you guys, keep them masonry on the ground, which is what our current code is? Or are you guys open to allowing PVC or other type structures, which seem to be more typical of what they do now?
I think
on
the
other
last
hand,
one-
so it's
the
kind of
last
a
one we saw-
quality versus-
I think the last one we saw was PVC fence.
Yeah, the well, the it was
Vinyl.
the comment one, they originally came to me with platform, that's the new way they're doing these as a platform. And then we made them put it into a structure, but then they screened the structure also for security.
Right.
Some fencing, so, but they still did that little masonry structure, so.
Well, you know, I'll just speak for myself. I think if the little masonry structures are tasteful and done well, it's nice. You know, as long as it's not overly burdensome, I mean, I think it,
And someone could still get a variance based on the site conditions.
right. I mean, it is, again, as long as it doesn't look like a shack, it's a more attractive structure, and it's also not an attractive nuisance, you know, to invite in, you know, vandals, you know, to brick structure, so. As long as it's not, you know, according to the new statute, considered overly burdensome or something, I'd be in favor.
Yeah, so
of
they
sticking
wouldn't be,
with that.
it wouldn't be covered by that at all, because
Okay.
the new state law is small cells in the right of way, so they're not gonna have anything like that, so this would be more on your standard tower, kinda like we saw
Yeah.
with that one in the ComEd easement. And there is with pretty much any home that's been built from 1970, we have masonry requirements, so
Mhm.
it kinda can blend into the surrounding
Yep.
masonry that we usually require on the first floor of most homes, so.
Any thoughts? We'll start on this end over here. Any,
Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
keep the masonry.
right, same.
I
All
would
right,
agree with that, yeah.
Masonry.
all right.
Prefer to stay with the masonry at first option, but they always have the ability to request a variance, but masonry would be the first go.
So then there was a question which I think we already kind of covered with Commissioner Beck's comments about the, yeah, so obviously there's special cases. So I don't know how you would handle that from a wording standpoint, you know, you're essentially trying to carve out a principle, right?
I think that we prefer it to say to the rear or the side of the building, and then we help determine what those sides are.
And ultimately, if for some reason they think we're wrong, and we really shouldn't be, with any variation, interpretation, there's always an option, a way for them to get relief. I believe it's coming before you guys or the zoning board, one of them that basically, you know, they can formally challenge our interpretation or something of it. But I think it'll be pretty clear in most situations what we need, so.
All right.
On that wording.
And I think we answered the last one too as well, didn't we? No?
Decorative pole?
Decorative
Yes,
poles?
we
Yeah.
do. We're just gonna get a legal interpretation, and we can outright prohibit it, otherwise we'll keep it at the very last.
Sounds fair. All right, I had a couple other questions here, but I wanted to see, we've covered the ones that staff needed some feedback on. So, starting here with Commissioner Gray, do you
Yeah, yes.
have any other comments there?
Yes, Commissioner Shaw. I do have some, even going back to that first consideration, it's just my interpretation, so if there's no environment, you can't challenge something on environmental or health effect. I understand it. My understanding is aesthetics, you can. And so I would keep that probably open so that you would allow for public input, because if it's behind somebody's house, they know the aesthetics, or they're intimately aware of the 24/7 aesthetics around their place and how they would be impacted. So I wouldn't shut the door on that first one for just, well, we can't discuss environmental health, so just no public input. I think it's good to ask the people, the public that live in that vicinity, or at least give them an opportunity to speak. If they don't speak, then so be it. So that was just one comment on that. And I have some others. Go through my notes here. In the meantime, if somebody wants to speak, I just got to collect my
All
other
right,
notes.
yeah, we'll come back to you.
None at this time.
All right,
I have nothing at this time. Nope, good.
far end?
I would say the existing locations, in the interest of streamlining the process, I feel like that would be okay, just not to have a special use permit, but all the other ones.
Yeah, those are site plan.
Correct, that's how we have it set up, is
These are
Okay.
any,
towers.
So existing, and then the village, if it's on village property anywhere else, then it has to be a special use.
Okay.
Perfect.
There are no comments from you?
I just wanted to get a clarification here. So let's say one of the schools decided they were going to do this, like, let's say Central Middle School, they were gonna put the small cell stuff on their parking lot lights and lights around there. That would not come before us, or that would?
that would, so.
It would come before us,
Yes.
okay.
Basically, any small cells that are not covered by that act are special uses.
Okay.
So if it's on private property or public
Okay.
property that's not a right of way.
I see, okay.
Not
Just-
covered by that act would be a
Okay.
special use in that case.
Good question. So, you still need a couple minutes?
This is what happens when you.
No, I can go ahead. I got.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, I'm good. You just tell me when you're ready.
Sure.
I was gonna ask you about the half sentence, but you covered it. The shot clock that you're talking about there, is there any other area that you're aware of where we have that kind of mechanism?
I'm trying to think about,
It's okay if you're not sure, because I said that you're aware of, there may be one and you just don't know.
yeah, antennas.
And
are
that's
the
fine.
big- Antennas and communication facilities are the big one, that the FCC has been the
Maybe
pusher.
people doing right-of-way work, maybe?
Yeah, I was thinking of, yeah, because we do right-of-way permits for utility companies, but I don't think that's ever been an issue where I don't know if there was ever a need to implement some rule like that.
Right.
And
Yeah, I'm
then
just.
The other big kind of question mark in terms of land uses and stuff, it always becomes religious uses, but I don't think there's any laws attached to
Right.
that have that
Right.
shot clock mechanism attached.
Yeah, and again, I've only been doing this a couple of years here, and I hadn't seen anything like that, and so I was just curious if that was just something that I had never seen, or if it was.
I think that's the pull of the cell phone carrier companies that have gotten that. I mean, and that's been there since '96 for your regular antennas, and then now it's.
So,
too, so.
Yeah, and it just seemed to me that some of the other examples you gave there were more professional courtesy, trying to move things along quickly, right? As opposed to, legislated. So what is that, given that that's new, is how well-formed are the regulations on it? When does the clock start?
So whenever they submit and it's in the state law, and in that federal law, it's basically when they submit a formal application, or I think it even says attempt to submit in there. So if
Okay.
someone pushes away at the front counter, that would start a shot clock technically, if they can. They'd
Okay.
have to somehow prove that eventually.
Right.
Usually, I'll say this, they try to not be combative, because they really don't want to get into a legal, they try and avoid legal fights at all.
Yeah, I will tell you, again, that the
So it's
very
usually
small
only goes
number.
into that when there's, municipalities are saying, just trying to ignore them or something. But it is whenever they formally submit some kind of application or try
Okay.
to.
In my experience, they usually followed up with us with an email and asked for something in writing saying, your application hasn't been approved, here's the steps. So we've been good about that.
Yeah, and as I was saying, there's a very small number of them anyway, and the folks who have been here have seemed, at least when they're standing here, they seem like cooperative, so.
And we have clear context. I think some of the issues of why that law's in there is if you get into more rural towns and they're trying to put these up, sometimes you have one person working there. You have a clerk that's part-time and one other person working there, and they don't get any responses. Well, eventually, it needs to be allowed, and that's kind of what
Right.
they determined is that shot clock runs out, they can go put the tower up, but.
Well, I think that you just answered the other questions I had, which was, what's the penalty if the clock runs out and you haven't acted on it?
They have a legal
Then they
right.
have it by right. Okay.
But there's a lot of stuff that restarts that shot, so that's why it's a shot clock, is once it hits the rim, the clock restarts. So if we send them a response
Okay,
that says,
that's what my concern was here, is procedurally, if I just fill out a piece of paper and say, I want to put up a cell tower, and I sign it and I drop it on the counter, you need some plans, you need this and that,
yes, so and that.
So it's a-
you could
it's a
do that, and
complete-
we're gonna say, here's our application, we have a formal application that has a full list of stuff we need.
Okay.
Here you need to submit plans, we always require structural engineering requirements to make sure, even if they're attaching it to something, it can support it. So
All right.
we have that full list, you need to submit it, then that clock starts all over again.
All right, so if I'm kind of hearing you guys have given this a lot of thought. My concern would be.
We've been doing it since most municipalities have been dealing with it since '96, so it's a
Okay.
pretty common thing. It's not used a whole lot by cell phone carriers that I've seen.
Yeah, that's fine. The big thing to me was whether we would anticipate, first of all, that's why I asked you earlier, is there going to be a rush on the village now for this? It sounds unlikely. But also, would you anticipate any sort of process or staffing issues? Because as I see it, not we or you, but the, legislature has essentially given a special right to this industry, which if you think about it, with limited staffing resources, if you guys are in there working on, somebody else's project, and all of a sudden these guys come up with their shot clock, you have no choice but to set aside this guy's project, to deal with that, which
is true. They've already started to talk to us, specifically AT&T. We're working on a master pull agreement with them right now, and I think even though they kind of pushed this legislation, they're also not trying to get any backlash because they kind of got their way with it. So they're being, from what I've seen here at our village, as well as from what I've heard from other villages, is they're being pretty all of them are being pretty cooperative right now. Giving time, they're not throwing applications at us, they're trying to get stuff worked out ahead of time. So that we haven't had any issue like that.
That's good. All right, when Commissioner Beck was talking about the downtown legacy district and, hopefully the development plans and everything we have coming up here, increasing the volume of people, and even when we, in our current state, when we have the downtown events and all that, it's hopefully only going to increase our problem. And then I started thinking about the amphitheater out there, and you were discussing, I remember when we had the distributed antenna system come before us, that they essentially attached to all their light poles and created a network there. But it sounds like, again, you just answered it, working with AT&T, it would seem to me that it would be wise to be proactive about that with our downtown, anticipating that we're going to have that volume and have a plan for it up front, as opposed to trying to retrofit, once we start building things up, and then trying to figure out how we're gonna get all these thousands of people, cell phone signals in the heart of our awesome downtown.
And it'd be nice if they came up with a village plan of here's all the polls we want to do ahead of time. They're still not really to that level.
Yep.
They are kind of picking, they know the areas they have to hit to start filling in these gaps, and they do kind of seem to have some, here's the roundabout locations we need to get in, and they've been relatively cooperative to find the least obstructive place, knowing that they have some leverage now, but it's pretty cooperative.
So I only had one other question here, and and it's slightly off topic, but you were talking about pole burying, and I know we have a sidewalk program where we identify sidewalk gaps, either for repair or to have complete streets, and I just don't recall ever seeing whether we have an explicit plan where we have targeted which lines. I know, like South Street, that's part of the development. We're going to bury those lines, but just in other areas, do we have any sort of a targeted thing where if someone came in and said, hey, we'd like to put it on this pole, we would know that that particular pole is, number 200 in our program, and it's we're going to bury it at some point. Just.
I'm not aware of a program. It's costly to do that. I mean, obviously the downtown, it makes sense.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, in certain districts, we would plan to do it with redevelopment. Right? So perhaps we haven't made a formal list, but we know that, hey, we're going to have a big redevelopment of this stretch here. When that happens.
Or rebuilding of roads is a big one. So when you have to fully reconstruct roads, that's a good time to put them below ground, because you're tearing everything up. You still have to pay ComEd to get their equipment under there and stuff, but you've eliminated a huge cost and a huge problem of replacing stuff because you're doing it anyways.
Yep.
But we don't have that formal plan that I've seen. It's just mainly been the focus on North and South Street currently. But it kind of, if we have a road plan, that would it'd fall probably in line with that, but I don't think there's any active plans
Fair point. All right.
that are attached to the pole.
I'm done. Anything you got?
Sure. If I could I just want a clarification on page 1 of 13 exemptions. Under exemptions, letter A, it says the village is exempt from the regulations herein when there is a demonstrated need for telecommunication services provided by the village. Could you give an example? I just wanted clarification on demonstrated need.
Yeah, that wasn't my wording, but I think the intent of it is that we would have some kind of evidence that, especially with a lot of our emergency telecommunication radios, they have separate antennas. I believe the village hall does, so do our firehouses and stuff. I think that would, there'd be we'd have some evidence that those are needed for kind of our needs.
We're exempt from the process.
Correct.
We're exempt from the
Understood.
process, but yes, it would mean that when we're putting them up, we have to show some kind of actual need for it.
So you're talking about the village putting them in?
Yeah, the village is exempt when we can demonstrate there's a
Right.
need
And
for
I
the village to have it.
And I think a lot of it is fire, police, and health.
Yeah.
Health and public safety reasons.
I know the one town I was working in, we're building a new village hall, and a component of that was a new tower for police
Oh, yeah.
and all their
Yeah.
new equipment, and we were
And I think there's one on the roof here that kind of sticks out pretty well. But yeah, it's needed for the radios and stuff.
And then page 2 of 13, 3 general regulations. B, it says the petitioner shall demonstrate that the proposed antenna or antennas and support structure or structures are safe and that the surrounding areas will not be negatively affected by support structure failure, falling ice, or other debris. That's letter B. And my only question was, is more specific direction needed, or directions to the petitioner needed to streamline the process? So you tell them exactly. I wasn't sure if that included structural calcs, but I see on G, there's structural integrity, and it mentions the codes and TIA 222-H. But I guess what I was to avoid going back and forth, it's more specific on exactly how one demonstrates that the structure is safe from some of the negative impacts that it lists.
Yeah, I think that one's supposed to maybe be a catch-all for any other things that aren't structural related, even though it has that part in there.
Sure.
I don't know if that's just supposed to be a catch-all for
So
anything that we could deem unsafe.
To understand your question, is it the burden is somebody has to prove that it's safe?
Well, yeah, it says shall demonstrate.
As opposed to proving that it's not unsafe? Or I just...
Well, maybe are you looking for, which I've seen in the past, where a structural engineer will provide a letter, like a release saying, you know, the structure was built for our design, you know, and their design was, you know, approved by, you know, building code, you know, all that. So, you know, they could just sign it, stamp it, and then there it is. It's safe.
And that's what I originally wrote was, you know, calculations stamped by a licensed structural engineer in the state of Illinois. But G is structural integrity, so to me it was, but I think
And that was added, so G, because I remember when I was getting hired here, I was watching the meetings and I think you brought up
Yes.
G and wanting to add that in there to
Yeah.
get extra, the kind of teeth in this. So I think that was just added on top of B. B used
Right.
to be what carried it, and now G kind of dives into the structural part way more specifically, but we still kind of left B in there, I think, just to be
a
you know,
catch-all.
I guess for the
Okay,
falling ice, just generally.
Fair enough.
It's
Right.
safe. I think that sometimes it's good to have kind of stuff a little looser, because if we see something that just for some reason is really unsafe, but meets all the other requirements, we can point to that and go, hey, show us it's safe. But yeah, I think G covers your structural part of it.
Okay, it's good that I see you did the research 2 years back. That's good, Dan. And then last is just a comment that I see also on page 4 or 5. This is for a different animal, but in terms of going to the village building codes and any requirements, I think it's good that you guys have the standards in the language. I think that helps the village's standpoint. So I think that's good. That's it.
All right. Any further questions as a result of the discussion? Any other open points that you don't
I think I'm gonna
think
take
we got
the
answered?
fact that we're gonna keep special use for new structures. It sounds like, and only one person really vocalized that.
Yeah, I think it was also expressed down here, but just fair point that you went explicit comments on it. That's my position on it, and I felt that was the consensus of the commission.
I would agree with that.
It's relatively rare too, so it is what one other thing we did clarify in here, which for like the last one that came before you guys, where there was a pole completely technically it was a new pole, but it was completely concealed within the structure, the existing structure, the ComEd tower. That I believe we changed the language, or the intent was to change the language to, and I'll double check, to make that permitted. That would be, even though they added a pole that's completely covered and surrounded, it would be permitted in that case, so.
It was site plan approval.
It was,
but
yeah,
not
still site
Right.
plan, but not special use, it would be considered a co-location on the existing structure, so, yeah, I agree with the special use is gonna be pretty rare anyways for a new one, and that gives everyone fair notice.
All right, sounds good. If there's nothing further on that, we'll move along with our agenda here, which is good of the order. Anything interesting and new going on?
Nothing that you guys aren't already apprised of as far as developments, but again, just echoing Paula's comments, it's been a pleasure working with you, Ken. I wish you all the best, and I hope you definitely stay in communication and be a part of the community in some way or form. I'm sure you will be.
Thank you. You might actually see me out there once in a while.
Yeah, give us a call.
All right, any comments from the commissioners before we receive public comment? All right, and there's public comment, and with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn this evening's meeting. Moved Commissioner Vec, second over there somewhere. Second Commissioner Gray. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Meeting is adjourned.